Today, I'd like to go into the idea of truth and reality. In the 21st century, in a modern scientific society, the general idea is that we live in a physical universe and that this physical universe is infinite. So there are endless galaxies and the universe is expanding at a rapid speed, and you can assume that, given the word infinite, that things will go on infinitely. So we can't really imagine a beginning or an end, in the sense that we don't know how the Big Bang came about and we don't know what the end will be. So there's a question mark of where did the Big Bang come from, and also where is the universe going, as it were. Is it going to a kind of finality and then it will just disintegrate? I don't think we know that. So on the everyday level, we live in a world or a planet that is very physical, and we say that everything we see is material, is matter. And then we know that you can go into the nature of matter and find molecules and atoms and subatomic particles, and go right down to the quantum field. And the general idea that is that at the level of probability, the particles become waves and the waves become particles. So you might say that there's a kind of general idea that there might be a basic energy that is the energy of the universe, if you like. So you could say a primordial energy, a primal energy, what might be called the unified field theory. So if you look at the nature of the reality of the universe, the physical universe, you could say that it's basically reducible to a kind of energy. So you could say at the seed of the Big Bang, if you take a seed, then the seed kind of divides or explodes, and the nature of time and space expands into an infinite universe. Now, the scientists, if you ask a scientist, well, what was before the Big Bang, they wouldn't give an answer. They would just say there is only the Big Bang. So if you said there was nothing before the Big Bang, I don't think they would accept the term nothing. In other words, they wouldn't want to discuss even the idea of nothing is before the Big Bang, because they want to say that the Big Bang just happened and there's nothing that you can't talk about what happened before that. Now, in terms of consciousness, the idea of a materialist is that consciousness, thought, and memory is part of the material brain. So what we call the mind or consciousness is part of the material brain. So when you go to sleep and you dream, or you have visions or hallucinations, or you go into the psyche in terms of astral travel, all of that is reducible to a material process in the brain. So that's still what they call the mind or consciousness in the brain. So when the physical body dies, everything dies with it. So consciousness dies with it, the psyche dies with it, the self dies with it, the personality, everything dies with it. Now, if you look at another point of view, say by Carl Jung, he said that the psyche, which includes consciousness, the psyche, the mind, is actually separate from the body. So the psyche isn't actually connected to the brain. It's in a different dimension. So you could say there's a physical dimension and then there's a psychic dimension. And he says that the psyche, the mind, isn't attached to the brain, but there is a connection because consciousness must connect with the body so that you're conscious of the world around you. You know, you see the world around you, but you're also conscious of it, and you can think about it, you can communicate, you can meet other people, and they can communicate with you, and you can share information and that kind of thing. So obviously consciousness, you might say, extends into the body, but isn't actually part of the body. So it's like if you take a field, it's a field, psychic field, that you might say interfaces with the physical field of the brain, but isn't actually directly connected through a material process. So you've got the material dimension, you've got the psychic dimension of thought. So you could say in many respects, the psyche may be of the nature of thought. And the human being can use that thought to think. And so when you use thought to think, you use a memory and you use language and communication. Now when you dream, you could say, when you're in a dream and you've left your body and you're in the dream, you could move over to the psychic dimension. And again, if you fall asleep and you go into the psychic dimension, the point being is that yourself, your identity I should say, your identity being part of consciousness isn't actually in the brain. So when you go to sleep, you go into the psychic dimension, and that's where you are anyway. So you're not actually in the body, you're not in the brain, you're actually in the psyche anyway. So when your body dies, and things go dark, as it were, just go dark, you just go into the psyche because you're already in the psyche. So you're not really going anywhere when you die. In the same way, when you go to sleep, you just go into the dream. It's just like an automatic thing because you're actually in the psyche. And then there's the other proposition that alongside the psyche, there's a spiritual dimension. So in the idea of the spiritual dimension, you have ideas of God, you have ideas of Christ, you have ideas of Buddha, you have ideas of Nirvana, and in Tibetan Buddhism, Nirvana is you have the body of wisdom, or the diamond body. So when you're in the physical dimension in a physical body, you're in the psychic dimension in a psychic body, and you're in the spiritual dimension in a spiritual body. And someone like Buddha left his physical body and entered into the spiritual dimension and put on a spiritual body. So in Tibetan Buddhism, in the investigations of mysticism, in the investigations into the psycho-spiritual nature of reality, it's saying that the identity of the person who was Buddha, so the person who was born Buddha was Siddhartha Gautama. That was his actual name. So we're saying that the identity of that person, Siddhartha Gautama, that identity exists in the psyche, in consciousness. It doesn't exist in the body. So we're actually saying the identity is actually in the psyche. Now, in his investigations, in his meditations, as it were, he seems to have accessed the spiritual dimension, and he went into the spiritual dimension. So he was no longer limited to the psychic dimension. And when he went into the spiritual dimension, he realized his true self. So the true self of Siddhartha Gautama was realized in nirvana, in the one mind they call it. He realized his true self. So he found out that he wasn't limited to his identity, his psychic identity, his psychic personality. He actually, he made a distinction between his identity and his self. So in order to make a distinction between your self and your identity, you need to be illuminated. You need to be what they call self-realized or self-aware. So you need to move into the spiritual dimension in order to differentiate yourself from your identity. So you could say that when you physically die, as it were, then you go to your natural source, which is in the psyche. Your identity, personality is actually in the psyche, and it's an illusion that you're in a physical body. You're not actually in a physical body. Now the self isn't in the physical body, and the self isn't in the psychic body. So then you've got a further illusion that the illusion is that your identity, your ego identity as Siddhartha Gautama is actually your real self, but in fact it's not your real self. Your real self is actually a spiritual entity. In modern science, there's the idea of multiverses. So there's not only this one universe, but there are many universes. Maybe there are infinite universes, physical universes. And it's possible also that, according to string theory, there are many dimensions. So it's quite possible that there are many dimensions like the psyche. So if the psyche is another dimension, then there could be many dimensions that we don't know about. So there could be many psychic dimensions, as there are physical dimensions, but there could be many other dimensions, including the spiritual dimension. But the point about the spiritual dimension is that, according to the one mind, there is only one. So you could say that the whole of reality, all the physical dimensions, all the psychic dimensions and other dimensions, that's reality. And then there is only the spiritual one, because the one is the one. It's not 1, 2, 3, which is infinite. You go 1, 2, 3 to infinity. So you could say there are the infinite universe or the infinite psyche. So if you take reality to be based on infinity and the one to be based on eternity, which is a circle, which is a perfection, then that means there can only be one. And that was developed by the philosopher Plato. He developed the idea of the one. And in Chinese Taoism, the Tao is actually referred to as the Great One. So the principle of the one is quite universal. And also, the one is synonymous with God. In the Western tradition, God is the one. And in ancient Egypt, the god of wisdom, Thoth, is actually the one. So the principle of the one seems to be the universal idea of the absolute. So the absolute would mean there is nothing beyond the absolute. And the absolute, you might say, enfolds, encompasses, like a circle, encompasses the whole of reality. So there's nothing beyond the one, which is absolute. So if you take the physical universe, for example, if you take the physical universe, then you've got the primordial energy. If you take the primordial energy, so there's an invisible quantum energy, and that pure energy is still connected to the material universe. So you've got the pure energy, then you've got the wave and the particle, then you've got the atom and molecule, and then you've got gross matter. You've got the matter that you see around you in the trees and everything, and the planets. That's all like gross matter. So that primordial energy, which is like invisible, well, the one is even, you might say, finer. It's like a finer material, but it's not connected to the primal material energy. So the primal material energy exists in reality. So existence is reality. It exists in reality, but the one is not in reality. So you could say the substance of the one cannot be described. You can't describe it as an energy. You can't describe it as, if you take the psyche, if you take psychic energy when you dream and you're in the dream world, and you take that psychic energy, it's not reducible to psychic energy. Now, the point about psychic energy, from a materialist point of view, psychic energy doesn't exist. There's only material energy. But people like Carl Jung and other people studying parapsychology, they say there's a psychic energy called psi. So there's a psi field of energy. And that psi field of energy can create telepathy, for example. So if you're in a room with someone and they're thinking a thought and they're going to say something, you can know what they're going to say. So there's like a transmission between your consciousness and the other person's consciousness, and that connection is what they call the psi field. But remember that your consciousness is not in your body. So you're communicating mind to mind, not using your body. So when you're mind to mind in telepathy, then the psi field, the energy is connecting the two, because in effect, the two minds are part of the psychic dimension. Just like two bodies are part of the physical dimension, the two minds are actually part of the psychic dimension. So that means to say, if you go into the psyche, or when you go to sleep and you go into the psyche, you can meet other people there. Hypothetically, you should be able to meet other people there. And people say that they've met people that have died. So Carl Jung said that he went into his psyche and he met his wife who had died. That's what he said. So you could say, for modern science, they haven't yet discovered the relationship between the material energy and the psychic energy. And most scientists don't believe that there is a psychic energy, but there seems to be a psychic energy. I mean, I've had my own experiences of telepathy, for example, so I'm pretty sure it's true. So if we look at the one in my own experience, that when I'm sitting here now and I'm looking through my eyes at the physical world around me, then of course you have light and space. So everything I see in the daytime is lit up by light and space. So as I'm looking at the light and the space, I'm using my thoughts to speak, I'm using my thoughts to identify the different things I'm looking at, like the tree and the castle, etc. I need my memory, my language, my consciousness, my thought, and my speech. So that is what you might say is a field of knowledge. So I need that knowledge to know what I'm doing when I'm going around the world. I need that consciousness knowledge to know what I'm doing. But as I say, the consciousness itself is not actually in the body. So when I'm looking out, I'm using my consciousness, I'm looking with my eyes at the light and the space. Now when you bring in the spiritual dimension, then you can't really talk about it. It doesn't have a content. It's, as I say, it's a kind of, I wouldn't call it energy, because it's not, you see, when you say energy and you say there's gross matter and then you've got the atomic and the quantum, you're reducing the hard material down to some refined energy. So you've got this very, very refined energy. But I'm saying it's not an energy. So you can't talk about it in terms of the material universe. And I think you can't talk about it in the psychic sense. It's not thought, it's not dreaming, it's not images, it's not that kind of thing. So again, it's not a content. You can't talk about the one mind as a content. So when I'm sitting here now, myself, not my identity, my personality and my consciousness, but myself sitting here looking from a spiritual dimension, I would define what I'm perceiving as emptiness. So nirvana is basically emptiness, or shunyata is emptiness. So the one, which is zero, nothing, no thing, so it's not a thing. No, dreams are a thing, and physical matter is a thing. So, you know, in the physical dimension, the psychic dimension, you're talking about things, and things are things that exist, and existence is reality. So we're talking about an awareness of the one mind, which is empty. So the reason why the word emptiness is used, it means it's literally empty of everything you know. So in the physical universe, the scientist knows everything about the physical universe, and in the psyche, the identity, you might say, knows everything about the psyche, hypothetically. And when you go into the spiritual dimension, you're yourself, but you don't know that. You're not conscious. You're not conscious of anything because there's only one. So you can't be conscious because there's nothing to be conscious of. So you're simply one. And it's empty. There's no context, there's no content, there's nothing you can say. So I'm saying this sense sitting here now, when I'm looking, my sense of self and spiritual awareness is in the one, and it's emptiness. So that emptiness is, you might say, holding up the physical reality. So in a sense, it's eternal. Therefore, you could say it's always beyond the infinite. So if the infinite universe is expanding, the absolute oneness is already beyond that. So it's already containing all of that. So if you expand infinitely, you'll never reach eternity, because eternity is beyond any concept of time and space, or any concept of infinity. So you can never reach it, and yet it's right here now. So the one, the emptiness, is everywhere. And because it's one, and it enfolds everything, it has to be everywhere. So it's right here now, in the room, it's in the sky, it's everywhere. But in reality, you might say, not in reality, but in fact, the one is beyond everything. So as I look at the sky, the one is beyond that. If I went to the end of the universe, it would be beyond that. If I go in the psyche, it's there, and it would be beyond anything in the psyche. So any dimension, any universe, the one will always be the one. So the one, you might say, is independent, is absolute, whereas reality is dependent, interdependent, interconnected, interrelational. So you might say, just as Carl Jung said the psyche is in coincidence with the body, but they don't connect directly. They connect through the psi field, which is not a material process. You're not in the psyche, the psi field conscious is not actually connected to the physical dimension. And when two people have telepathy, it's from mind to mind. It doesn't, the body's not involved. It's just mind to mind. The brain's not involved. So if the psyche isn't directly connected to the physical, then the spiritual is not connected to the psyche or the physical. So even in the sense of telepathy, which is a mind to mind, is a psychic dimension. In the spiritual dimension, there's no parapsychology, there's no telepathy, nothing like that exists. Because you don't need any communication, because you're one. So if two people were in a room and they were in the one, then there wouldn't be any need to communicate on any level, physical, psychic. You wouldn't need to speak, You wouldn't need to think about anything or know anything about the other person, because you're one. So each person is one within the one. So there is only the one, and you're in the one. So each self is in the one. But each personality, each identity is in the psyche. So there are multiple identities, there are multiple personalities in the psyche. So in the world, you have all types of people psychologically, and people you have identities of mother and father, identities of artists and pianists and politicians. They're all personas, they're all acting on the world stage, they're all identities, personalities, and that's not your true self. So you might say that, as I say, all of the personalities in the world, all of the people in the world, in their personality, they're not actually in their body. Nobody's in their body. And in the psyche, you think and you communicate in relationship. In the one, there is no communication, there is no relationship. So you might say you're communing together. Two people in the one are communing together, and that communion is itself a oneness. And all knowledge is in consciousness and psyche. That's the field of knowledge. In the spiritual, that's the field of wisdom. So when the Buddha went into nirvana, into the one mind, he put on the diamond body, or he put on the body of wisdom. So really it's a very simple equation. You have the one and reality, the reality of things, and the reality of things is existence. And if the spiritual dimension of the one, emptiness, is something unlike anything else, it's not physical, it's not psychic, it's not reducible to any form of existence or reality, then you could say, what's the relationship of the one to reality? Or you could say, what's the relationship of the one to the psyche, or the one to the physical universe? So I would say the one being everywhere in reality, therefore the one hypothetically is self-aware of the whole of reality. So as I'm sitting here in the one, by implication I'm aware of the whole of reality. Of course I'm not conscious of the reality. There's a difference. When you say you're by implication you're aware of the whole of reality, that doesn't mean to say I'm conscious of reality. In a sense, I'm conscious of talking now. I'm conscious of looking at the castle, looking at the sky. That's what I'm conscious of. I'm conscious of thinking. I'm conscious of using my memory, of communication. That's all I'm conscious of. I'm not conscious of, what I can't see. In my memory, I can be conscious of, I'm in England, and England's near Europe, and Europe's in the world, and the world is a planet, and the planet's part of the solar system. But I'm not conscious of that. That's just using my memory. What I'm actually conscious of is actually speaking now. I'm conscious of the castle, because I'm using language, that's a castle, and so forth and so on. That's all I'm conscious of. That's what consciousness is. So if I went into a dream, I'd be conscious of the dream. if I went astral travelling, I'd be conscious of astral travelling. But I'm not conscious of the whole of the psyche, and I'm not conscious of the whole of the world or the universe. That's why I disagree with the term cosmic consciousness. There can't be anything called cosmic consciousness. But if you say the mind, the one mind, enfolds the physical universe, then yes, the one enfolds what I see with my eyes now. The one enfolds the physical universe, the one enfolds the psychic dimension, because it enfolds the whole of reality. So by implication, when you're in the one, you, in one sense, you're aware of the whole of reality, but you're not conscious of it. And you could say, well, what is, when you say you're aware, or by implication, you are the whole of reality, what does that actually mean? Well, for me sitting here, it's just the simple fact that I know that I have this particular perception, that I'm self-aware, and I have this particular perception called the one, emptiness. And I know that because I've experienced it, or it's not an experience, because you experience things through consciousness, because you identify an experience with your consciousness and your language. So the point being that when I became self-aware at the age of 23, I didn't know that I was self-aware. I didn't know that I didn't know about spirituality. I hadn't read any books on that subject. I'd studied comparative religion, but that was just more or less the institutional religion and the dogma. I didn't study specific experiences and very, very sophisticated philosophy and concepts of religion. So I didn't know anything about spirituality, and I wasn't brought up religious. So when I became self-aware at 23, I had an immediate sense of illumination and freedom. And then when I started reading the texts, I found out in Tibetan Buddhism, which was the second book I read, I found out that when Buddha went into the one mind, it was known as liberation. So that sense of being liberated, being free, freedom, and the sense of becoming your true self, that's exactly what I felt. So I felt that I was connected directly to myself, not to my ego identity as a student or whatever. In my consciousness I was a student, and I was studying philosophy, etc. When you're aware of your true self, you're not talking about being conscious, you're not talking about knowledge, you're not talking about what you remember. So those two things, your true self and freedom, I found that meant that I was enlightened. Now, the difference between my enlightenment, which is in the one, is that my enlightenment is what you might call embodied or immanent. That means I'm aware now of the one, but I haven't left my body, I haven't left my psyche and gone to a spiritual dimension outside of my body, outside of my psyche. That's where Buddha's supposed to have gone. But because it's the one, it's always the one. So whether it's the one in the sense while I'm living, or it's the one if you died and you went into the one, it's still the one. So I knew that what I had come upon, what happened to me spontaneously, was the one. So what another term they refer to in terms of the one mind is that they just use the term reality. So they see the one as reality, and that's what I'm saying, that's what I'm actually saying, is that the one enfolds reality. So you could say either that the one is the only reality, or the one enfolds reality. Now, the idea of the physical universe, you might say, is that it was created. So from the Big Bang, you call that like a creation. So if you're an artist and you get a seed idea, like the Big Bang, you get a seed idea in your psyche consciousness, then you can expand that into painting a picture. So it's the same process. From a seed idea, you expand and paint a picture. So likewise, in the physical sense, you have the seed of the Big Bang and it expands into the universe. So hypothetically, in your psyche, you could expand the seed idea infinitely, if you could actually do that infinitely. So if you have, like, say, philosophy, if you're thinking philosophically about the one or the absolute, that seed idea in your mind, if you're going to write a book, that seed idea in your mind could expand into 500 pages of describing what the one is like. So in a sense, you can expand that seed idea into a whole philosophy, and that's what people did, like Plato and Hegel. They wrote hundreds of pages of speculation and theory on what the one might be, or what thought was, or what consciousness was. So you could say, what does it feel like for a person like me to be aware of the one? Well, I would say being aware of the one in my daily life, which is permanent. So for 50 years I've been aware of the one. I would say it's a very simple fact. Just like I'm sitting here looking out of the window, or I make a cup of tea, or I have my friend comes and we talk about religion and spirituality and parapsychology. These are ordinary facts of daily life. And so is the one. The one is just an ordinary fact. And it's really nothing special. Now, in your mind, in your consciousness, in your mind, when you read books about God, about the one, about nirvana, about transcendence and all of that, you're reading those ideas and they're expanding in your mind, right? They're expanding in your mind. And you imagine what God is, you imagine what the one is, you imagine what the universe is, you imagine what the Big Bang is. You imagine in your mind. But of course that's what your mind does. You exaggerate, you inflate it, what they say, you inflate it. Literally you expand it and you idealize it, and it becomes a fantastic idea. But in reality, it's very, very simple, because it's emptiness and nothing. Because it's emptiness and nothing, there's really nothing to say, and there's nothing to get carried away with. You don't have to, your conscious mind no longer has to imagine it and get carried away and exaggerate the importance of God, or exaggerate the importance of Christ or Buddha. It's just a simple fact. So in Zen Buddhism, when they discover the one mind, or what, the satori or enlightenment, They say that's your self-nature, that's your true self-nature, and they say that's your original face. So in other words, it's what you originally look like, as it were, if you looked in the mirror. Now, what they say is, when you are in Satori, when you're in enlightenment, which means Satori, and also Zen means meditation. So when you're in Zen, you're in pure meditation. And they say it's the simplest thing in the world. There's just nothing to say. It's the most simplest thing in the world. And they also say, when that happens to you, it's as if you've already known it. As if you've already known it all your life. Well, of course you've known it, because you're a self. And you're actually in the one, but you don't know you're in the one because it's not consciousness. You can't be conscious of the one. You have to have something has to happen to show you yourself is different from your ego identity. But when you grow up as a child, you're in your identity, you're living in the world, and you're living in your consciousness. And yourself, you might say, because it's not conscious, you don't know that the self is there. You're always yourself, but you don't make that distinction. So if you're driving a car, you're a particular person driving a car. You're an identity, you're a person, you're driving the car, you're going to see your mother or your father, or you know, you brought your child along, so you're the father going to see your mother and father. You're just yourself driving the car, but you're an identity to the world around you. But in fact, but yourself is there, but you're not making the distinction. But when you can make the distinction, then you realize the self is not your identity, the self is not your persona. So it's not that your self is not there all your life, and that the one is there all your life, because the one is everywhere. The one must be there, because the one is everywhere. I mean, the one is literally around the trees, around the animals, around everything. The one is there. And once you make that distinction, then you feel at home in the one. There's no problem. It's like a light going on, and you think, yes, that's the, no, I'm just myself, and that's the one. Now the point is, when I had the experience, when I had that thing happen to me, I didn't know what it was. All I felt was free. I didn't know what it was. Then I started reading books, and then I had the context to say, yes, that's what I'm experiencing, this sense of freedom, this sense of oneness with the world, and then I could identify that. I could see that was a fact. And so in your consciousness, by implication, you exaggerate things, you inflate things, you idealize things, you imagine what things are like God, what could God be like, what could Christ be like, what could Buddha be like, what could other dimensions, other forms of reality, and so forth and so on. But that's all your consciousness doing that, imagining. That's what the psyche does. It's a field of imagination, so to speak. And when you're not using your consciousness, and you're just, say, I'm sitting here, and I'm not using my consciousness, and it's quiet, so it's like turning down the radio so you can't hear the music. It's still on, the radio's still on, my consciousness is still here, but I reduce it, I turn it down, so it's quiet, so my thinking, my feeling, my consciousness, my memory, my thought is not interfering. So if you're talking to someone, you turn the radio down, so it's not interfering with your conversation. That's perfectly clear. So the same thing, I can look out here using my eyes, not using my consciousness. So I'm not conscious of anything, because the self is one. It can't be conscious because it's always one. There's nothing to be conscious of. There's just the self as the one. So if I'm sitting here now, and when I'm not talking right now, and I just look out, I see the physical nature around me, the sky and the trees, and the one is there. And the one, as I say, is not an experience, it's not a material experience, it's not a sensory experience, it's not an experience of consciousness or thought. And the sense I have as I look out is one, and from that, what I would call spiritual perception, my spiritual perception in the one means that I can see the order of the world around me. Everything's in order. There's a kind of order of the physical universe. And that order is related to beauty. So I can see now the beauty of that order. So it's not just simply the beauty of the sunlight on the birch trees, or the sunlight on the red Virginia creeper, or the golden stones of the castle. It's not any particular kind of beauty. It's simply the fact of spiritually being aware of the beauty. That's a spiritual perception. That's not your consciousness, because your consciousness can only know relative beauty. So you know the relative beauty of a particular object, like a painting or a piece of music or something like that. It's very fragmented, it's all part of thinking, and it's made of images and language. So it's not really pure beauty. So you've got pure order, pure beauty, pure freedom. And another term is openness. The one means that you're open to everything, because the one is everything. So what they say is, nirvana is samsara, so that's emptiness is the world, samsara, and samsara is nirvana. So when I'm looking out at the world is inside the one, inside the emptiness, and the emptiness is in what I'm seeing. So when I say the emptiness is in what I'm seeing, I mean the emptiness is around what I'm seeing, but it's also inside of everything. So emptiness and the world are one thing. But the difference is that samsara, the world, the material universe I'm looking at, is only relatively stable. It can be reduced to energy, and maybe that energy could dissolve into nothing, and that nothing is the one. So what is the relationship of the one to, say, energy? If you say reality is reducible to a quantum energy, and reducible to a psychic energy, so the psyche is reducible to a psychic energy, and the physical universe is reducible to a quantum energy. So you say reality as a whole is reducible to energy. And I'm saying that the oneness, the nothingness, the emptiness isn't even a refined energy. If you think of a refined energy being the most invisible form you can think of, it's almost nothing. Just like when you look around you, the sky, the light and the space, it's like it's invisible, but we know it's full of atomic energy and quantum energy, even though it's invisible. And I'm saying that the one, the emptiness, is invisible, but it's pure nothing. So you've got pure energy, but the one is pure nothing. So you can't even think about it in your consciousness. So a physicist can't think about that. You can't actually think about it. And yet you can be, you know, in a sense, your true self, everybody's self, is actually in the one. And if you haven't made that distinction between the spiritual and the psychic and physical, then you can't know it. You can only know in your consciousness. So either it happens to you or it doesn't. Either you can come upon that in your inquiry, in your investigations into spiritual things. Maybe you can come upon it, maybe you can't. I mean, people go in a Zen monastery and they seem to gain insight into Satori, into the emptiness and the oneness. And they have flashes of insight. And it may last for a second, or it could, I don't know how, you know, it could last for days or years or months. I don't know. And they say that usually if you become a master, that means that, I assume, that means that you're in the one all the time. Then often you leave the monastery and you just become an ordinary person. You're no longer a Zen master. So when certain Zen poets say that there is no Zen, there is no Buddha, there is no practice, there is no posture, there's no meditation. So when you come out of the monastery, it's like taking off the identity of a Zen practitioner. So you're taking off your consciousness. You're going out of your psyche into the spirit, and so you're just a self in the world. You're just one. And so you're living in the city or living in the countryside. You're no longer Zen. You're no longer identifiable as a Zen person. You're just an ordinary person who's self-aware. And nobody knows that. Nobody needs to know that, because it's very innocent. You don't need to tell anybody. You don't need to communicate. Because you're in the one, there's no need to communicate. There's no need to relate. There's no need for anyone to know that. And it seems to me that what the Zen are saying, the Zen poets, is that they live an anonymous life. They may know each other, but generally they live an anonymous life. And I can imagine going right back into the ancient past, in prehistory, in Aboriginal times. I'm sure there were people who were self-aware. And we can't really say how many people are self-aware in the past and in the present. I've no idea how many people are self-aware. But as I say, it's just an ordinary thing. When you're self-aware, it's the most natural, ordinary thing, and you don't need to let anybody know. It doesn't give you any influence, it doesn't give you any power, it doesn't give you any prestige, it doesn't give you any sense of being special, because it's just the most natural thing in the world. So you could say, in a way, that it's more natural than your consciousness and the physical world. You know, we say nature, and we think that's very natural, it's very free and liberating, nature, and the universe is creative, very free. And in your imagination, in your psyche, as a creative person, you can be very free. But the pure freedom of the one means that you're free of having to prove anything. You don't have to prove anything to anybody. I mean, in the world of consciousness, in the world of society, you've always got to prove yourself to other people. You have to prove yourself in relationship. You have to prove yourself in business, in politics, in science, in music, in art. You're always proving something to other people. And that's all right. In the world, that's perfectly all right. That's how you do. You compare yourself, that you're in competition, etc., etc. But a self-aware person, nobody needs to know that. You're independent. There's an absolute sense of independence and freedom. And like me, if you communicate in video or you write books, then you try to communicate what you've learned, what you've studied, what you've discovered, and you're just sharing that. But yourself, your self-nature, you're not dependent on that. You're not looking for influence. You're not looking for feedback. You know, you've just done what you wanted to do. Just like people paint pictures or whatever. They do what they want to do. And then they try to sell the painting, or they try to earn a living, or they want people to enjoy the painting. So I'm just sharing what I know about spirituality, what my life experience has been like, and it's like take it or leave it, that's fine. And another thing I would say, that there's no need for anyone else to know about the One. It's not something I would say that I'd recommend to anybody, or think they should do that, or that they'd be better off doing it. Maybe they wouldn't be better off doing it, who knows? But of course, once you're in the One, then you're in the One. And you don't think you're better off. You know, your life's better, your life's worse or better. I mean, the One is the One. There's no thought about it. There's no language. You're not saying you're happy or sad, or you've got something, or you've lost something, or you're privileged or not privileged, or no, you're just free to be yourself. And yes, I mean, for me that's a good thing, but I wouldn't say that it would be a good thing, obviously, for each person's self to be one. Yes, of course, it's a good thing. But if you live your life like my parents and whatever, and they lived their life, they weren't religious, they weren't spiritual, and they lived and they died, that's perfect. I think that's perfectly all right. They live their life. And I think, after all, I'm only living my life. And if this hadn't happened to me at 23, I'd have just lived a normal, natural life. No, I don't want other people to be in that condition. It's not like that. See, if you say the pure freedom in the One, this sense of freedom, it's not freedom from anything. So if you're a person, you haven't made the distinction between self and identity, and you're living in the world, and say you're an artist, you enjoy being an artist, you lived a good life, you enjoy being an artist, and you meet someone like me and I talk about being free in the One. You see, now the artist is free doing what they do, and if the artist, say, was talking to me, and I said, well, I'm free, as you know, I feel free in what I'm doing, I'm not comparing my freedom to their freedom, and I wouldn't say, oh, you'll be more free, you know, if you think you're free being creative, you'll be more free in the One. Well, it's not like that. Because when you're in the one as a self, you're free as a self. But I'm also an artist. I mean, I've written poetry and I've done art. So I know what it means to be free as a creative person. And if you're a creative person, you don't need to know about the one, because it has its own kind of freedom. I mean, just like a child has its own kind of freedom, but it's not the freedom of the adult. And when you look at nature and the animals, they have their own kind of freedom. So each aspect, you might say, has its own kind of freedom. So of course my freedom in the one is different from my freedom enjoying going into a museum or reading a book or talking to a friend. It's a different kind of freedom. It's got, so I'd never say you're more free or you'll be free from your problems or anything like that. It's nothing like that. When you're in your consciousness and you're in the world, I mean, I've got to deal with problems with people, problems with situations where I live, and the environmental problems in the world, and being sensitive and aware of what's going on in the world. That's your ordinary consciousness. But that doesn't interfere with my freedom of myself, because it's a different kind of freedom. It's the freedom just to sit here and look at the beauty of life. Or the feeling of compassion when you're seeing what's going on in the world and you have the spiritual awareness of compassion. But if you're involved with a relationship and it's not going right and you're trying to talk to somebody and show your feelings and everything like that, well, the compassion isn't necessarily relevant. You can't use compassion, you can't use freedom, you can't use the one, you can't use beauty. But when you're painting a picture, you want to paint a beautiful picture. When you have a relationship, you want a loving relationship. So if you get along with, say you're living with someone who's self-aware and in the one, they're free. That doesn't mean to say you're not going to have problems in your emotions or problems in your environment or problems that come up in your relationship. Even though you are self-aware and free, you're still functioning in your body, you're still functioning in your consciousness, you still have an identity, you still have a name, you still paint pictures and write poetry or whatever you do. You still got to deal with the vicissitudes of everyday life, and every day there will be elements of problems coming up that you live and deal with. And when you're sitting quiet in a room, or you're walking along the river, or you're looking at then you can be free. You can turn the volume down, the noise down in your consciousness, and just turn it down and pay attention and look at the world. Or sense the world in compassion, or sense the world with love. All depends what you want to do. But as I say, it doesn't make your consciousness perfect, it doesn't make your body perfect, it doesn't make your consciousness free, it doesn't make your body free. It doesn't make the world beautiful and loving and full of compassion. It doesn't work like that. I mean, a scientist can know incredible things about the universe. A psychologist can know incredible things about psychology and consciousness and all of that, but they can't solve the problems of other people just like that. Can't solve the problems of the world. That's why each person has got to deal with their own level of problem. If you're a politician, you're a doctor, you're a mother, father, you deal with your own level of problems. There's no panacea. You can't wave a magic wand and say Buddha could solve all the problems, or Christ could. Of course not. God can't solve all the problems. I mean, that's why the problems aren't being solved, because there's no power to solve those problems. So the absolute power of the one, or God, can't solve the problems. In fact, quite the opposite. It's the simplest thing in the world. and it's simply not what people think in their consciousness. They think in their consciousness that God and the Absolute is some almighty power that knows everything and can control everything. And of course it's exactly the opposite. But the One, that doesn't mean to say the One in your life, as it were, isn't doing anything. But what it's doing, I don't know what it's doing because it's not in consciousness. When you're in consciousness, you know what things are doing. You know what you're doing when you're painting a picture or you're in relationship with someone else. But in the One, now, I have no idea what it's doing in the world. It must be doing something in reality, but I don't know what that is. If it's holding up reality, and it's everywhere in reality because it's emptiness, you might say it permeates the whole of reality psychophysically, any dimension, then of course it must be doing something. You could say it's the life force keeping things going. It could be that principle, that kind, not energy, because energy is measurable. But if you take the immeasurability of the One, then you could say the life force, if you want to use the life force, is keeping reality going. And that life force, you say, like animals, you say the life force animates animals, animates trees, and animates the human body. And then you could say in the psyche, conscious, that's also alive. And then you say, well, what is life? And then you could say, if the One is synonymous with life, that gives life to reality, gives life to creation, you could say it's the life force of creation. So it keeps creation going. You could say it like that. So you could say, in one sense, wherever there's creativity, it keeps it going. So you could say the seed of the Big Bang has the life force. The seed of an idea, like painting a picture, has the life force. The seed of a tree has the life force. The seed of the cells in the womb, the fetus, has the life force. And they say the breath of life is breathed in to creation, the spiritual breath of life. So it does actually, it might mean that whatever we call creation, that gives birth to everything, but gives birth to the psyche, gives birth to the physical, that moment of creation, you could say, if the One is the One, which is nothing, and then there's like a gap, there's a gap between the One and reality, just like there's a gap between the physical and the psychic and the spiritual. There's this interval, this apparent gap, which is, so if you think of the One and reality, that moment of creation is coming out of nothing, and that nothing is, you could say, the breath of life. So you could say the pure energy, the pure emptiness of the One is the life force, the breath of the Spirit, that animates the universe, that creates the universe. And in every level of creation, going right down to the tree and the animal and consciousness, imagination, painting pictures, creating music, etc., then that inspiration, that you might say flash of insight, that moment of creation is the animation of the life force of the One. And that's what's keeping everything going. So if there are multi-universes, then obviously universes are coming into being. The universes may last forever, indefinitely, or they may collapse and disintegrate and new ones are created. So you could say the whole cycle of creation, the whole cycle of reality is infinite. If the one is eternal, then the eternal creates the infinite, and it's just an infinite creation out of the one. But the one is the one. So you could also say that the self in the one, all selves, because all selves on this planet, all selves in the universe, on other planets, in other dimensions, all selves are always in the one. And then you become self-aware and you realize, yes, I'm in the one. But you may live your life and not know that. It doesn't really matter to me. So if all selves are in the one, and the one is independent, absolute, then that means it can be without reality. It doesn't need reality. And yet if it creates reality, then if reality itself came to an end, the one would still be the one. So when you're in the one, it doesn't matter whether reality exists or not. But if you come out of the one into reality, into another dimension, you incarnate in a body, as it were, you incarnate in a consciousness and in a body, then, as I say, you're always one. But when they say in Greek mythology that when you incarnate as a human being, you enter the river of Lethe and you forget. So when you incarnate, you forget yourself. You forget where you came from. And the whole point of living, having a consciousness, learning, you're learning to live, you're learning about life, and you build up a memory so you forget, and then you start remembering as you live. And the ultimate thing you want to remember is yourself. That's what you want to remember, because you've forgotten yourself. So in your ego identity, by implication, you've forgotten yourself, because you're obsessed or absorbed by this life, by the world you live in, by other people, by conditioning, by history, by the environment, and you get lost in the world. You're lost in the world until you remember yourself. And that's self-knowledge. And then when you remember yourself, by implication, you're free. So the Buddha could leave his body, go into nirvana, and then he could come back into his body. So that means he can go back, you can go back into the one and come back into the body. But when he came back into the body from the one, this time he knew who he was. He was a free self. And he didn't need to reincarnate anymore. He didn't need to be here anymore in order to remember himself. So all knowledge is basically self-knowledge. So the scientist, in looking for the ground of physical reality, is really looking for their own ground in themselves. They're really looking for God. They say they're looking for the mind of God, but they are really looking for their own self. They're looking for the ground of their own being in their self. And that's the journey, that's the, you could say that's the thing that's very interesting in being the human being, reading books and travelling, because you're learning and you're enjoyable. And as I say, it doesn't really matter whether you remember yourself or not, because being here is a journey, and you enjoy each other's company, you enjoy the animals, you enjoy music, etc. Of course, there's a lot of inequality in the world, but basically speaking, hopefully things will get better and better, but some people think it's getting worse and worse. I don't think so. I think it's all right. But the point being is, whether I had become self-aware or not really doesn't matter to me. I could have lived my life without becoming self-aware, like my family, a lot of my family. So all I'm saying is that part of the process of knowledge, called self-knowledge, is about becoming spiritual. That means becoming spiritually aware of yourself. And it's no great shakes. It's not like, oh yeah, it's much better than being an artist, much better than being a scientist, much better than being... No, it's not better than anything. It's just in a different category. If you enjoy being an artist, you don't say, oh, I enjoy being self in the one. It's not like that. It's very neutral, it's very balanced. It's not about emotional things or thinking and imagining and getting inflated with all exaggerated ideas. No, it's very, very simple, very ordinary. No, so enjoy the life you have and learn what you can. And part of the learning is to understand the physical universe. Part of the learning is to understand the psyche and dreams and mythology and magic, and learn about poetry and learn about whatever it is you learn about. And part of the learning process is self-knowledge. If that interests you, it interests you. I mean, before I was 23, I didn't even know it existed. And my parents, as I say, lived their whole life without religion, spirituality. They enjoyed their life, or not.